It is my pleasure to chair the second session, and now actually the actual researchers doing the work are going to present their work. We have organized it in terms of, rather than going through the three themes in each of the sites that would have been complicated, we've decided to use each of the sites to illustrate one of the themes. So we'll begin with Kuala Lumpur, the journeys. Diana Wong, who is from was the University, Kebangsaan, National University of Malaysia, a sociologist, has done a lot of work on development, modernization, and migration, and has been part of the project for almost from the very beginning. Then we'll have two of the researchers, and has been the team research coordinator in charge of the Kuala Lumpur research. Then we have two of the researchers in London. Will be presenting placemaking in London, and are Anne David and David Garvin from Roehampton University. And David has worked mainly with the Hindus, Tamil Hindus in London, particularly on issues of dance and body and tradition among the Hindu tradition. David Garvin has doing work with Bengalis in London first, then Kimbangis and Pentecostals and different groups in London. And then we have Samadhya Saduni from the Wyss Institute for Social and Economic Research. Is one of the researchers from the Johannesburg team. Will be presenting the Johannesburg-Durban team of circulation. And her own research has focused mainly on the Somalis, refugees, Muslims, and the whole relationship of Somalis to other South African Muslim groups. Diana.
Okay, there's no PowerPoint presentation. I think I'll take about 15 minutes because you need about 30 minutes for your presentation, right? No? Okay, I'm going to talk about the theme of journey. The theme of journey brings a temporal dimension to the study of migration and religion, which is actually quite central to the Malaysian study. There is now a familiar distinction in the academic literature between the migrant communities, which were formed by the colonial migrations of the 19th century, and the diasporic networks, which are currently being spawned by contemporary global migration. Although generally treated as two distinct historical waves and forms of migration, many contemporary diasporas, in fact, consist of earlier established migrant communities, which have since settled in the new nation states that had helped to found, and are now being reinserted into the new diasporic networks which have recently emerged, and that holds for the case of Malaysia. That's the first preliminary observation I'd like to make. There's a second preliminary comment I'd like to make, and that is, for us, another important distinction for understanding the context in Malaysia, namely that between traveling religions on the one hand and faith-bearing migrants on the other. The mass migrations of the 19th century to Malaysia brought new faiths. The current migration regime does not allow the estimated 2 million foreign workers in Malaysia today to do so. As temporary contract workers or undocumented migrants, they bring no new faith nor leave any trace of their religious practices behind. The changes in the contemporary religious landscape in the country have been brought about not by new faith-bearing migrants, but by traveling missionaries and religions, which have changed the religious lives of the settled immigrants of an earlier epoch of migration. So, I shall discuss 3 points in the presentation today, largely illustrative of what Jose presented earlier this afternoon. The first relates to the fact of an intergenerational shift in the religious lives or in immigrant religion, from an undifferentiated community cult to a confessional religion. The second point I want to illustrate is the particular narrative genre which Jose mentioned this morning, in terms of religious journeys and the way that they are presented, narrativized. In particular, the link between the relationship between that is made between the migration journey and the religious journey, the spiritual journey. And the third point would be to illustrate again narratives which relate to the context of majority-minority relations in Malaysia. Let me begin with, we have looked in the Malaysian side at 3 different immigrant groups. 1, contemporary Indonesian labor migrants in Malaysia. 2 and 3 would be 2 immigrant groups with a longer history of immigration in the country, Indian and Chinese immigrants who came in the 19th century or under the regime of colonial migration. Let me begin with a group of contemporary Indonesian migrant workers. The Indonesian labor migrants are largely undocumented, unskilled labor in the construction and service sector. Similar in religion and ethnicity to local Malay Muslim society, we had expected incorporation into local society via the local village mosque. And also, given the popularity of the Tablighi Jama'at as a movement in Malaysia, there was also the expectation that the TJ Mosque would be another site of Muslim encounter for these new Muslim migrants. In the event, Indonesian migrant workers were not to be found in the local mosque, nor in that of the transnational Islamic movement. Collective religious practice remained within the parochial confines of the ethnic community, led by informal leadership from within the migrant community itself, and supplemented by visits from religious personages from the homeland. Denied the right to settle, Indonesian migrants remained transient sojourners. The point is this: the insular and ethnic character of Muslim migrant religiosity displayed here appears in fact to be typical for first-generation migrant groups from a rural background, in Malaysia at least, induced by the very nature of the migratory journey itself. Highly localized communities are reconstituted, often through chain migration, and held tightly together by the communal religious practices transported from the regional homeland. This was the case as well for first-generation migrants from our other 2 immigrant communities, the Hindu Naya Malayalis at the plantation frontier and Chinese migrants in the tin mining economy. The religion they brought with them was a community cult, a non-differentiated religion, involuntary and unreflective, with religious and ethnic identity fused together. I mean, the question that you raised earlier, I think, what's the difference between religion and ethnicity? I think is also an empirical one, where it is religion has not yet been differentiated, is a non-differentiated religion, and is embedded, where religious life is embedded in the household and the local community. There is no distinction between religion and ethnicity. Religion is ethnically marked, as in the case of Chinese folk religion, for example. In this case, conversion hardly occurred. The resultant religious pluralism was not characterized by competition, religious competition or conversion, but by eclectic practice and hybridity. It was only with the process of settlement in Malaysia, induced by the establishment of the nation state, that conversions among second-generation immigrants became common. Such conversions are indicative of a profound shift in the meaning of religion and religious life in emerging segments of immigrant society, from religion as involuntary community cult, non-differentiated community cult, to religion as a belief system requiring individual choice and commitment and a confessional personal identity. The shift from embedded to disembedded, from unstructured to organized religion. In interrogating the meaning of this new religiosity, we should note first and foremost its location in the socially mobile, urban, and educated middle classes, and the fact that access to these new religions is made possible, or these new religious identities, perhaps as a better term, is made possible through the reading command of the language in which these global religions are transmitted. In this case, English and Mandarin. Well, from their reading command of the language in which these religions are transmitted, and through which they acquire the linguistic codes which Jose was referring to, which framed their narratives and narrative structure of their spiritual and religious journeys. Language is the key medium of circulation and the main determinant of reception, but there I will encroach on the theme of circulation. So I will come to the second point, which I want to discuss today. The linguistic code, the semiotic structure, form in which narratives of spiritual and migratory journeys are made. And I want to give you 3 examples, contrastive examples, from our site. The first is that of they're all men of around the same age, 50. One is a Christian pastor. The second one is an informal kiai, ulama of the Indonesian migrant community. And the third is a devotee of a local deity in the Malaysian pantheon. The Christian narrative of Pastor Chan is classic narrative in the Augustinian mode. The trope of conversion. He was 15 at that time. The trope of a calling. He did not plan to become a pastor, to go into full-time service, but the call was made and he had to respond. A subsequent life of constant struggle, of personal conscience, constant dialogue with God, with respect to the decisions that he should make in his everyday as well as professional life, in his spiritual as well as in his further migratory journey. I would characterize his spiritual journey as a walk with God. Pak Yai, on the other hand, the Muslim ulama, no trope of no mention, no conversion, because he remained within the faith. No calling. It was a gradual, continuous, and deliberate volitional desire on his part to serve. I think I would characterize it as a narrative of faithfulness and a walk in the path of Allah, a clearly defined path that he was to follow. Not one, as in the Christian narrative, that had to be constantly, not negotiated, but constantly discovered, revealed. The third, Mr. Su, is also one of faithfulness, of devotion to this deity, it is, however, a faithfulness in the form of a contractual relationship. The deity had provided him, had saved him from drowning, and as a result of a vow that he made, he therefore now had to serve the deity. It was a contractual relationship, one of faithful service, but not something that he had decided upon from very young, but in a way a conversion, that moment of conversion when he was saved and made the vow. Now, what is interesting and what I want to draw out for you in these three narratives is the way that it is linked to the migratory journey in terms of personal and collective identity. Pastor Chan, in the Christian narrative, when he described his spiritual journey, it was quite clearly in the form of an I. Pak Yai, when he referred to his spiritual journey, spoke very clearly, used the term we. This referred to his son, for example, or the family, the religious family, the background that he came from. Mr. Su, when he spoke of his religious journey, specifically and exclusively used the I form. When Pak Su spoke of the migratory journey, however, he used the we form. The journey of the family from China to Malaysia was framed as a collective journey, even though he himself was born in Malaysia and was not part of that journey. The migratory journey of Pak Yai was framed as an individual journey, whereas his religious journey was framed as a shared journey. In the case of Pastor Chan, the spiritual journey was entirely an individual journey. The I form was used, but he had not quite forgotten how to use the we form when he spoke. As for example, when he spoke of the family, the history of family migration to Malaysia, he himself was born in Malaysia. He used the we form, the family. Okay, I just have another 5 minutes. The third point that I want to discuss is the context of, and narratives of the context of majority-minority relations. As Jose said, the context of minority-majority relations or minority-minority relations change also throughout time, the different regimes. And I just want to give you quickly what these different regimes were and how they impacted on religious discourse and religious identity formation. Colonial migration, I would suggest, was characterized by a regime of multiple minorities. I think in this respect, that's a major difference to the South African case, where there was also colonial migration, long-standing colonial migration. But in South Africa, you had a large white settler society, and that white settler society also formed the state, controlled the state. In Malaysia, it was a colonial state, but there was no white settler society. The whites were a tiny speck in the demographic landscape. So what you had, I suggest, was in the sense that Assad speaks of as desirable for the European context. We did, in fact, indeed have in colonial Malaya a contextual regime of multiple minorities where everyone was a minority. That was the point. The second contextual regime was formed or was in place during with the attainment of independence and the post-colonial state. That was framed by the needs of nation building, And again, one must remember the immigrants were given citizenship and were part of the founding communities of the nation. And so in that period, the language of minority was minority community was not dominant at all. It was the language was one of nation building together by all communities concerned. The third phase, contextual regime is one that began in the 1970s and is one characterized by the process of minoritization, where there is now a clear language of majority-minority relations, for the first time actually. And there we can discern two phases, when ethnicity was the basis of the minoritization, and more recently, where with the deepening process of Islamization, where religion has now become the basis of minoritization. I think what you notice then, in the religious discourses now of the minority religious discourses is maybe just three points I want to make. One, clear trend, self-representation of these minority religions as pluralistic and inclusive in character. This holds for Hinduism, for Buddhism, for Christianity. And I think it is obviously a counter narrative to the homogenizing hegemonic claims of the Islamic State. Religious discourse also offers alternative spaces of belonging, global Chinese community, Hindutva, whatever. And the third discernible trend in minority religious discourse is the emphasis on unity. Maybe I'll end there. Thanks.
Thank you. We move from Kuala Lumpur to London.
So in this presentation, we would like to address some important, significant issues bound up with the spatial experience of religion and migration, and the making and remaking of sacred places and territories in the context of diaspora. Actually, and as we shall see in this presentation, our very localized micro case studies we're going to present today cut across the three themes of circulation, journey, and place-making in some ways, right? First, I would like to say that we've been working with three different groups: Congolese Christians in East and North London, Sri Lankan Tamils in East London, and finally British Bangladeshis, mainly in the borough of Tower Hamlets in East London. Today we're going to only focus on the Congolese Christians belonging to the Kimbangwis Church, which is a large prophetic African-initiated church, and on the Tamil Hindus in East London. So we'll start with talking a little bit about London, and perhaps not surprisingly, the first significant aspect relates to the fact that London is a global city and is an urban regime in itself, and as such, a specific context for the production and reproduction of specific sacred and religious geographies. A former colonial center, London has become, in a way, a global city where landscapes of power, we were talking about that earlier on, have been produced. And for some religious groups, like Islamic movements, such as the Tabligh Jamaat or large Pentecostal churches, London may represent actually a hub or a sort of springboard for evangelization or dawah, where reaching out and connecting to other communities is possible, of extremely important in the narratives. And there's also a notion of moral regeneration, which is often expressed in spatial terms. It's also often a spatial regeneration And in our work, we explored, and also with John Eade here, issues around the conversion of small post-industrial places that Manuel was talking about, warehouses, former factories, and so on. And there's the idea here of symbolically filling the voids of the city, but also the more visible contested politics of iconic mega churches, mega buildings, mosques, and new built temples. So all this is taking place in a multicultural context, but also shaped by wider national and European even debates about religion and migration regimes. The second aspect of placemaking that we are interested in concerns the link between the body, the notion of territory as an appropriated space, so not a neutral space anymore, and the realm of the sacred through what we're going to focus on today, processes of spiritual embodiment and possession. So this is this theme that we're going to develop today in our presentation. In that sense, our aim really is to locate the sacred within and across different scales, but also against the backdrop of migration, transnationalism, and diaspora, as, quoting Johnson, a horizon of expectation which provides solidarity, purpose, identity, and futurity. So this temporal dimension is quite important. And the idea of the body also, the role of the body in religion is important as a container of the sacred, but also as a sacred space or sacralized space in itself. It is emplaced in different spheres, public or private, different imaginaire, sacred or profane, but it's also emplacing, since it is grounding or locating the spiritual experience in particular settings, as Kim Knott here has shown in her work. In that sense, and we shall see in our 2 case studies of spirit embodiment, that while the notions of personhood and gender can be very flexible and renegotiated through these processes of possession, the body also stabilizes spirits, which travel not only between ethereal and physical worlds, but also between places, crossing normal physical geographical boundaries. Finally, another important dimension relates to power dynamics, often associated with the idea of order, disorder, and for the Christians, and charisma for the Christians, and purity, impurity, and sacred hierarchies for the Hindus. This dimension, one of our objectives in this project was to explore the ways in which the notion of sacred power was embedded in the politics of public and private sphere as well. And this dimension, as we shall see, is very significant in the case study of Tamil Hindus, which Anne will now talk about.
Thank you, David. So, possession practices within Hindu religious ritual are a complex phenomenon, manifesting through different embodied states, emotions, linguistic expressions, geographical locations, and cultural and religious performance. Possession holds multiple levels of meanings, encompassing the norms and values of religious and spiritual experience within Hinduism that range from Sanskritic Brahminical ritual to local, rural cultural practices. It's also heavily reliant on present experience, yet is mediated by a historical and cultural mythology, providing a form where the personal and collective are yoked together as the individual internalizes the form of the deity. Public witnessing is of great significance to the event, allowing a corroboration of the extent of the possession, in contrast, as we shall see, to David's example of the Congolese Christians. An ability to enter a state of possession is indicative of sociocultural beliefs that identify powerful forces and influences outside the individual, in contrast to a Euro-American culture that identifies them within. Such ritual practice calls into question the place of the individual in the cosmos, viewing the embodied human self as a permeable, fluid, and even porous entity, available for the gods and the spirits to enter on demand or spontaneously. As we will see in the examples given, temporary divinization, such as possession and trance practices, are reinforced by sociocultural beliefs and are part of culturally codified behavioral patterns. Such exchanges between Hindu gods and their devotees are at the heart of Hindu worship. In the two main field sites I have focused upon in East London, two different instances of benign possession take place. In the more orthodox Shaivite Hindu temple, men and women will enter trance states during religious festivals, becoming possessed, it's believed, by the main deity of their temple, the god Murugan, and particularly the men will perform trance dances. These states are indicative of the purity of the individual and of the temple and of the event itself, and also significantly represent the power of the deity. The devotees becoming possessed at such a temple are from all castes, signifying a change in diasporic practices compared to those in Sri Lanka, Mauritius, and Malaysia, for example, where possession has been the prerogative of the lower castes and is looked down upon by the high caste Tamils. In a state of possession, of course, all boundaries of caste, location, family, age, and occupation recede, bringing a freedom from the heavily bound social and religious status valued by Tamil Hindus. The second example is of a small, newly established centre of Hindu worship called the Mel Maravatur Weekly Worshipping Centre, an offshoot of a well-established temple in southern India that offers, I would suggest, a form of neo-Hinduism. At this London religious site, Sri Lankan women offer their devotions to images of a male guru who lives at the mother temple in India and who regularly becomes possessed by the feminine form of the divine called Shakti. The women participate fully in all the religious ritual at this setting. Since in Orthodox Shaivite temples only male priests can play the role of the intermediary between deities and worshippers, this small but local site of practice challenges religious norms and offers the women a space where they can embody and perform the divine, giving them access to a religious agency that is commonly prohibited in Brahminical Hindu worship. Their guru, you see the slide here, Banguru Adigalar, when possessed, talks, walks, and acts as a woman and is referred to as she. His is an oracular form of possession. In trance, possessed by the divine goddess, he will give guidance to those who come to get his blessing. And through these oracular pronouncements, Adigalar has evolved new and detailed forms of rituals and ways of conducting the puja, the worship. This neo-Hindu approach allows worshippers of all castes, all ages, and both genders to engage fully in religious ritual, overruling, as I've said, the traditional Brahminical taboos that control women and lower caste devotees in ritual practice. As the goddess Shakti, Adigalar has vowed to empower Hindu women through the religious ritual, and his words are effective transnationally in many Tamil migrant communities across the world, and as we see here in London. We'll see now how this directly links to David's work on spiritual manifestations in the Kimbanguist Church, one of the largest African Christian prophetic churches.
Thank you. So in the very centralized Kimbanguist Church, access to spiritual power and charisma is generally more associated with the idea of inspiration rather than possession, and needs to be regulated, especially within the place of worship, which constitute not only a religious space, and we're talking about this notion of religion and ethnicity, but it's also a public space for the enactment of ethnic and diasporic belongings. In addition, there exists what we could call a traditional Kimbanguist management of the body, characterized by restraint, especially during collective worship. And the prohibition of dancing is one of the key Kimbanguist principles, dating back from Simon Kimbangu's ministry in the 1920s. The context of the regulation of both the body and the charismatic gift is the quasi-hegemony of Neo-Pentecostal Christianity in the Congo and in the Congolese diaspora. So it's a very important context. In that sense, the particular set of Kimbanguist bodily techniques, this technique du corps that Mose was talking about, represent a crucial boundary. On one hand, we have the idioms of control, centralized order, discipline, but also moderation, in the use and display of charismatic power. This is the Kimbanguist ethos. And on the other hand, in their narratives, they're talking about the disorder, the individual lack of control and excess attributed to the theology, organization, and practices of Pentecostal churches. So in that sense, the boundary and the performance of the sacred is an essential marker. Another important element is that the centralized structure of the Kimbanguist church relies on a particular location of the sacred, in Kamba, which is the birthplace of Simon Kimbangu in the Congo. And this is where resides the current spiritual leader, one of the grandchildren of the prophet founder. He tends to keep the monopoly of the legitimate use of these charismatic gifts, which is a precious symbolic capital of his religious authority, especially in the context of a major crisis at the moment. So when in London, several women became possessed by the spirit, the milimo, of the prophet Kimbangu and his sons, debate started to occur about the boundaries of spiritual power in the particular context of the diaspora. This eventually led to a violent conflict, which triggered the first division of the church in the UK. The division was between those who saw in the coming of those spirits a divine intervention, and against those who saw in a more evil influence between these possession phenomena taking place in London, again described as a global city of powerful occult economies, right, to summarize. What is interesting is that for many, the coming of the spirits was closely linked to the experience of migration. That's why the theme of journey here is coming. In fact, through their revelations about the immoral behavior of some of the worshippers, the spirits were seen as agents of social control. So there was a dimension of agency, with the mission of reviving the faith and the obedience to a strict and authentic Kimbanguist code of conduct. In that sense, the spirits, through the women mediums, were helping the moral transition, the reterritorialization of a Kimbanguist ethos and order in the new context of immigration. So since there were spirits traveling transnationally, they were connecting places, they were enabling a sense of ancestral home in the diaspora, as well as providing hope for the future and providing divine protection in times of uncertainty. That was at the beginning of the migration process. Difficulties linked to the incorporation in the new society were also addressed. During the early 1990s, one of the main concerns for the Congolese Kimbanguists was linked to their immigration status, mostly their asylum claims. So the spirits were then consulted by the worshippers asking for help to regularize their status in the UK. So these spiritual manifestations, as depersonalization or repersonalization of charisma in the Weberian sense, were clearly embedded in contested notions of spiritual authority. In that sense, the opposition against the practice needs also to be understood against a specific theological and prophetic order, which has been gradually reinforced in a current context of conflict over the leadership of the church in the Congo. So the arrival of the spirits in the body of these women was thus posing a real challenge to this prophetic territorial order, since the possession rituals involved embodied performances of divination, but also healing, which implicitly but publicly in the space of the church contested the prophetic closure, the monopoly of the spiritual leader to regulate those gifts based in Kamba. So I think now let Anne raise some concluding points.
So to conclude our presentation, we have found several elements of heterogeneity amongst these migrant groups in terms of embodiment of the sacred, as well as significant communalities. The revival of faith and the importance of religious power in fractured diasporic settlements is a key factor in scales of emplacement, and along with possession experiences, provides a way of negotiating the tensions and uncertainties of the migrant predicament. For Congolese and Tamils, the power of prayer, possession, and of miracles assist, it is believed, in the obtaining of visas, asylum status, or even the gaining of employment. In the remaking of religious landscapes, or new layered placemaking, a heightened sense of global consciousness or connection is a marked feature of Congolese Christians and Tamil Hindus. And in both groups, we find meta-narratives through spirit possession of the negotiation of social and cultural changes linked to the migration experience. The final slide now. Emplacement often involves renegotiating the boundaries between public and private spheres. And in terms of the Tamil groups, there is a marked increase in more public displays of religious ritual, despite the often contested nature of their religious sites. Outdoor Hindu festivals in London can now attract several thousand people. For Congolese Kimbanguists, spiritual manifestations outside the private sphere is problematic, that is, in the public sphere of the church. Hence, the spiritual embodiment of Congolese women, the milimo, is thought by some to bring disorder and a lack of discipline. Embodiment is seen as a threat to the prophetic order, especially in diaspora where control is more difficult. Possession in the Tamil Hindu groups is indicative of the body itself becoming a site of contested narratives where the sociological, the psychological, the political, and the religious meet. The ritual practices, such as mentioned above, are increasingly on display in this diasporic context, indicating both a newfound confidence in the settled community and a need, through the performances of more elaborate and dramatic rituals, and these include the firewalking, we haven't touched on that today, firewalking and body piercing, to heal the tensions and traumas experienced in diasporic life. Both groups discussed reveal resistance strategies to establish norms of worship, offering a counter-discourse where power is decentralized and closure, that is, changes from Brahminical Hinduism, and in prophetic closure for Kimbanguists, is challenged. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And now Samadia will help our imaginary circulate to Johannesburg and Durban.
Open folder. Okay. That's done. Samadia. Do you want me to do it for you? So just introduce it. Yeah. Okay. You have to do that. Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
Well, I'm going to use the materials and data of my colleagues Thomas Blom-Hansen on Indian immigrants, Hindus, and Muslims in Durban, and of Caroline Genera on the Kimbanguist Church in Johannesburg. I'm going to present two themes related to circulations, models of proselytizing, which I will introduce with the Arabic term of da'wah, and models of internal conflicts, which I will introduce as well with an Arabic term of fitna. So let's start with the first theme. I'm going to define these models of proselytizing da'wah across religions, and I'm going to give some illustrative cases of these models of da'wah, how they circulate, the geographies of circulation that Peggy theorized and Kim Note described. There is no formal way in which the church with a capital C or its members go about getting new members, especially Muslims and Christians don't go out to convert. So da'wah is more a path to authenticity. And this question of authenticity is best illustrated by the authentication of properly trained Hindu priests to serve at temples across South Africa, as Thomas Blom-Hansen shows in his work on the South African Indian group in Durban. So this is a quote. Yeah, I think it's okay. A quote of the chairman of the committee overseeing the modern Sri Lakshmi Narayan temple in the township of Chatsworth, which is at the outskirts of the city of Durban. And so I'll let you read that Thomas just focus on this kind of purification, of authenticity, that the Hindus, the South African Hindus, are really looking for the proper Hindu priest coming from India. So for the Indian immigrant Muslims in South Africa, mainly represented by the passenger Indians and their descendants, and to a lesser extent the indentured laborers who migrated at the end of the 19th century. For these Indian immigrants, most of them had to face a double minority situation in India and then in South Africa. However, in South Africa, Dawah was mostly used by ulama Sufi preachers as a way to consolidate Muslim identities within Muslim territories. So the Indians had the freedom of religions in South Africa, and this freedom of religions was also linked to the obligation to settle in particular areas designated by the colonial authorities and then by the apartheid regime. So they formed a religious public space built along ethnic lines. So a quasi-Dalal Islam, a house of Islam, was indeed formed at these times and across generations. And Dawah in the South African context is mainly related to community discourse, to community borders internal to the community. I'm going to illustrate these circulating models of Dawah among Indian Muslims, and I will mainly talk about two religious movements which were important in South Africa, the Barelvi and the Deoband school of thought, born in India in the 19th century. These movements have been domesticated and grafted onto existing distinctions of class and community in South Africa, the one I have described, the passenger Indians and their descendants, who are mostly Gujarati and who were free to settle in South Africa at the end of the 19th century, and the indentured laborers who came to work on the sugarcane fields and their descendants, an Urdu-speaking community mainly concentrated in Indian townships like Chatsworth and Phoenix. The core membership of these two movements are represented by organizations of ulama. For the Deoband, the Jamiat Ulema, and the Sunni Jamiat Ulema for the Barelvi. The representatives of the Barelvi Islam in Durban, the most popular and important movement in Durban and KwaZulu-Natal, are the descendants of Sufi Sahib, who is a da'i, an agent of Dawah, who was sent from India by the Chishti Sufi order to South Africa in 1895 to consolidate the whole of Islam among ordinary Muslims in the country. So the Barelvi Islam encouraged the use of folk rituals among the Urdu-speaking Muslims. One of these community cults is the celebration of the birthday of the Prophet, Milad al-Nabi. But I will come back later to this aspect of popular Islam. However, we need to understand new waves of Muslim migrations, and especially African Muslim migrations, imposed on us to give a new history of Muslim geography of circulation related to Dawah. By taking the example of the Somalis, I want here to show the complexities of being a Muslim da'i in South Africa. The Indian Muslims had to face, during the partition, definitely the loss of a Muslim motherland. Few have identified themselves with Pakistan. And here, I'm not talking about the existence of transnational links between ulama from South Africa and ulama in India and Pakistan, but the average South African Indian Muslim who represent today the fifth generation. So to belong to a Muslim motherland represents an important symbolic capital in South Africa. This is what the Somalis have understood, in order to settle in relatively good harmony with South African Muslims in Mayfair, which is a suburb of Johannesburg, which is predominantly Muslim. So they claim to belong to an imaginary 100% Muslim country. The Arabic is also central in the way they legitimize their position in the religious public space and in the religious field, especially for the ones who are fluent in Arabic. They also give another geography of the Muslim Indian Ocean, different from the Gujaratis, because they are the Muslims who are the closer to the Arab world. Somalis are also represented in the imaginary as the model of the African Dai, the one who is the agent of the Africanization of Islam. South African Indians have failed to encourage in the country. But the Indians have failed to encourage in the country this figure of an African Dai. And a black Dai in South Africa is often identified as a Somali in Southern Africa. So this Africanization of religion is very important to understand the impact of any religious movement in South Africa, the way it circulates, in a global and post-apartheid city like Johannesburg. So now let's turn to the example of the Kibangis Church in Johannesburg. So the theology of the Kibangis Church, as you said, David, is what is considered to attract people, in particular Africans, and therefore allows access to God in a very different and new way. Kibangis Dawa is mainly related to social services, aspects which are also central to South African Muslim organizations and Hindu organizations. However, this social service dimension, which is central in the Kibangis Church, like in Nkamba, is difficult to realize for the Kibangis Church in Johannesburg, which is a poor church. And the church didn't develop yet its own social service institutions. On the contrary, in Congo-Kinshasa, the church builds schools and hospitals to cater for people's needs and hold large farms on which Kibangis work. The second way of proselytizing is to perform the service properly, and the services are divided in two parts. The first formal and theological part, which takes place inside the church, and the second informal social part, which takes place outside, during which people are greeted, and during which lots of marching for God takes place. And how this marching is performed in South Africa is quite different. And this is a photograph of Caroline Janera. And her comments. This march has been reinterpreted in South Africa, and the South African youth perform this marching more in common with South African forms of dancing during the struggle. So now I'm going to describe the second theme, models of fitna, internal conflict. So what is circulating, reinterpreted, and its mechanisms. Deoband and Barelvi movements represent both a theology based on faith in authority, authenticity, but also marked by polemics. So Barelvi context Deoband, also the movement Tabligh Jamaat, which is linked to the Deoband movement, leadership and vice versa. So this fitna among Muslims and also among Kibangis is mainly related to issues of authority. So who has the authority and legitimacy to lead the Muslim community and the Kibangis congregation? But here, we are more interested in this circulation theme about also how they legitimize such authority. About the Barelvi, they often use the method of takfil, the method of kufr, which means the people who are outside the mainstream of Islam, a fatwa of kufr by the founder of the Barelvi movement, who accused members of the Deoband as out of mainstream Islam, has been confirmed by ulama from the Hijaz in the 1850s. And this is a technique of internal conflict which circulated across space, across time, across generations, and from India to South Africa, but I suppose also elsewhere among Barelvi diaspora. And here we can see a quote presented by Thomas Blomansen that this fatwa is instrumentalized by Barelvi and Sufi Sahib descendants to identify wait, can you help me? So Sufi Sahib say that the Tabligh Jamaat, the Deoband movement, but in Durban, the followers of the Deoband movement are most commonly called Tablighi. And he says, for example, who are they to condemn our people as superstitious? The Tablighi are against folk Islam, these practices. And our forefathers came from India. We are Indian Muslims. Does it make us less Muslim if we are not Wahhabi? And that is it's a very interesting quote, because here it's all related with his fatwa of takfir. The folk Islam, the popular Islam, is the will representative of an Indian Muslim authenticity. And the Tablighi are equal to Wahhabi. The form of Islam which comes from Arabia, and the Wahhabi identifies as the one who have forbidden the Muslims to perform the pilgrimage on the tomb of saints. For the Kibangis church in South Africa is also fraught with tension about who its legitimate leaders are. And there are two, very briefly, there are two leadership positions, both of which are being fought over, that of the national pastor and that of the national representative. But I'm going to talk about the national pastors. Both sides in conflict agree that positions need to be appointed by the chef spiritual, who sits in the capital of the church, Nkamba, New Jerusalem, in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And both sides of the conflict challenge the symbols of authority, which the other side claims as representing its legitimacy of leadership. So the mechanism of circulation of contesting leadership and authority, the modes of Kibangis fitna are influenced by also by the transnational field. For example, Caroline gave the example of Pastor PJ, who has been granted by the chief spiritual by a letter, and he appointed Pastor PJ as the national pastor of the Kibangis church in Johannesburg. So the letter, the circulation of his letter gives legitimacy and authority. But the same letter is strongly contested by another faction. And a group which opposed Pastor PJ's appointment argue that it was not lawfully done and that it did not come from the chef spiritual, and that this group, their pastor, has also been appointed by the chef spiritual by a letter. So accusation and counter-accusation has been traded since 2005, and delegations have been sent to the the chef spirituel, and Nkamba in turn has sent delegation to Johannesburg, each leading to more debate, accusation, and confusion. And the form of this fitna is also occurring in Nkamba, important in South Africa, and readapted and reinterpreted for issues of authority and leadership. So the position of each side in this conflict depends on the latter. The picture taken in Nkamba, proving that it has direct access to the chef spiritual. But in fact, it is the congregation in South Africa which decides where is the truth. And furthermore, the church doesn't seem to work with phones or with Skype to pass on authority. So it seems that if the Kibangis church has an ability to circulate so easily like in South Africa, it's because of structure is flexible and religion is reinterpreted easily in another migrant and national context, like the famous fatwa of Maulana Reza Khan Barelvi in the 19th century and reinterpreted. That's it, I finished.
Thank you very much. And now Susan Martin has graciously agreed to offer some comments spontaneously without the benefit of having read any of these materials. So thank you, Susan. You are brave.
Thank you. I indeed am feeling brave, and largely because these are a fascinating set of papers that we've heard, and I think contribute to our understanding of the interconnections between migration and religion in a number of different and quite important ways. I think the comparative element to the research is fantastic, particularly in looking at some of places that haven't been as well studied in the context of this area, as is the case in perhaps North America or some other parts of Europe. The presentations on the specific cases, given that they were then trying to relate to a particular theme, I kept wanting to know how in each of the case studies the three parts of the project fit together. So I'm quite frustrated on that. Maybe where you wanted to leave me, because I certainly want to now read the papers and look at the full assortment. I hope others in the audience have the same view. And also, in light of the request that Josh made, that the speakers have as well, that this is still in a draft stage and constructive criticism might be useful in terms of the next steps. Let me raise 4 areas where, again, if I read the papers, perhaps this is all there. Not having read them, I'm left with some questions. The cases appear to be focusing on both recent immigrant groups as well as very, very long-standing diasporas that have been in place within these cases for generations. And yet it's not really clear from the presentations what are the differences in experience when you're talking about recent migrants versus minorities within these countries that originally came as a result of migration. And I'd like to have understand more about what the time dimension is, adding to this space or place dimension, and what the changes over time for these groups have been, and whether there's, to what extent the fact of the circumstances under which people originally came mattered in terms of what their religious lives and experiences were subsequent to that. Within that context, I'd also like much more on the impact of legal status that people currently have within these case studies. We've heard about citizens, about legal residents, about asylum seekers, about contract laborers, about irregular migrants. Does that matter? Does the migration history
matter in terms of the religious lives of these individuals. And that's one set of issues. Immigration policy, immigrant experience, time, status, I think really needs to be fleshed out much more than I've heard this afternoon. Second set of issues, one of the real interesting things about this research is that two of the sites were colonies of the third site, in effect. And yet, I'd like to, and it's great for a comparative project, but I'd like to know more about, did it matter what the direction of the migration patterns were?
Of whether it was intercolonial migration, as in the case of the Indians, migrants who ended up, or now diaspora, who ended up in South Africa or in Malaysia, or moving from the periphery to the center in terms of the movements of those same groups to London, or the movements of people like the Congolese who had no relationship with the colonial empire, but are moving into different parts of the empire. Just that whole set of issues, I think, could be fleshed out. And since it's such a strength of the project that you're dealing with sites that are within this view of empire, to know more about what all of that really meant would be quite helpful. The third set of issues is that I'd like to have known more about what the immigrant integration policies, to use that terminology, of the receiving countries and cities and communities were. And again, did that make any difference? And that's again needs to have a time dimension, since you are dealing with diasporas that have been there for generations, as well as new immigrants. And it's not just the integration policies with regard to religious practice, which some of you talked about and integrated into your presentations, but also all of the other types of integration in terms of language, employment, residential segregation issues, if to the extent that there was either enforced or voluntary residential segregation for some of these minority groups. What difference did that make in terms of the later experiences, particularly of being able to keep a religious community together and practicing within as a minority group? And how do enclaves operate in that context in these situations? And then the fourth area, again, I'd like to know a lot more about, are the experiences in the source country prior to migration. Quite a number of the groups that you're looking at in some depth come out of conflict situations, with the Sri Lankans or the Congolese. Had they already gone through something of a transformation in terms of religious identity, religious practice, concepts about religion, as a result of that experience of having been in conflict, and particularly when the conflict also had religious or ethnic undertones to it. So to what extent is it, again, the migration process that's at work, and to what extent is it what we're talking about are some of the factors that led to the migration in the first place, and trying to tease out those connections. So those are four areas that I think might help to strengthen the analysis on it. Maybe in your papers, not having read the papers, I don't know, but I'm really looking forward to seeing the entire set of work. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. This is very helpful. We have some time for comments, discussion. Maybe as one, I think that those are very, very important critical points. Particularly, we have not mentioned, but as part of the project, the final volume, there will be a comparison of the context that we'll have to do in a very, very concise form. This time, this history is different. So, as I said, there is a way of doing this as an external social scientist. We have adapted the voices, the narratives from the migrants themselves. So insofar as sometimes these questions appear very clearly in the migrant narratives, and then you can address them. But there is a need to contextualize those things, so it is our task to somehow, in the volume, bring those comparative context very clearly. So thank you, it's very good. Anybody would like to add? Jan, would you like to? Jan Eid, that appear in the title of the paper, is the third person, who is the coordinator of the London Research Group. So anybody would like to add something, ask something?
Well, yeah, I mean, I suppose taking up your point about the state regulation as Mandela was saying, in places in London, the ongoing wave of migration has changed in a formal context. So in the 1960s, primarily post-colonial migration, clearly from the 90s onwards, there were two other very different forms of migration driven by disruptions in states, leading to society that tended to have a very different state policy from going to state foundation of India, post-colonial context, but their experience of. And secondly, of course, new form of migration, which is more circular migration within Europe, driven by the entry of the Eastern European countries, because they are European citizens. And one of the things we did talk about, more about migrants, is about exploring, preparing new migrants to come back to the core, those who are obviously formed already set communities, very clearly demarcated ethnic boundaries, because they're very good at protecting very form of species. And the new migrants who come and go, and Europe is therefore area really. But I think what links is what Anne Daly talked about was a common perception amongst many community representatives or leaders or visitors that London is a very dangerous place. And you get this example in Tony hierarchy, which are extremely disturbed by all these polls going on in London. So there's a kind of common theme, despite these differences in the migration, about how London is a site of danger. And so, and the result of that are those practices to try and protect these different types of migrants from the consequences of this dangerous secular policy.
Would you like to add anybody? Anything?
There's one thing we haven't talked about, which is ways
Right. I mean, one of the things that, and this is a big difference between Kuala Lumpur and Johannesburg and London, that those are extremely dynamic, changing migrations even to them. In Johannesburg, after apartheid, became the kind of mecca for much of Africa, and those are really, really changing groups and changing space constantly. London also to a certain extent. In this respect, Kuala Lumpur really is a much more restricted place in a much more controlled migration.
You know, there are 2 million foreign workers in Malaysia. It's actually also a very, very large population. There are Rohingyas. So I think some other differences. For example, you were mentioning the importance of the provision of social services for the Kimbanguists and the Tamils in London and in the Congo. Now, that is not at all important in the Malaysian context for migrants. I think primarily the difference here is that in the case of Malaysia, you have, say as compared to Somalia, you don't have a failed state and you don't have a failed economy. these are the kind of structural conditions that I think you were referring to as important for contextualizing the kind of resources which religion could and would provide.
Can I just come in on this? I think it's quite interesting, this concept of London as a dangerous place, because yes, it is, but it's ambivalent, because it's also a place which is a place of safety if you're leaving war-torn Sri Lanka, and you've got your community already there in place. And it's in many of the interviews, people have spoken about the appreciation of the UK as a place where you can practice your religion. It's so tolerant and all the rest. There's this kind of narrative. So this is a very interesting sort of contested, well, I keep using that word, but ambivalent situation, really, of both danger and of, jobs and family and others to practice religiously with.
Same holds for the Rohingyas.
Right. And of course, one of the dynamics we have not really discussed, although it has been always in the background, particularly when we discuss South Africa, is of course the dynamic of post-apartheid, of it is privileged native majority that now is a project of really citizenship and basically taking, if you wish, becoming citizens, becoming fully enfranchised and benefiting, redistributing, and now confronting, of course, immigrant groups from the rest of Africa that have even come with better skills and perhaps, so the internal relations here is not only, so it was the old hegemonic minority, the white minority versus apartheid, different type, but now a regime of migration, that the conflict of South Africa that becomes the Mecca for all of Africa versus a nationally South Africa only for South Africans, and the kind of conflicts that was very different conflicts. So this is a very important dynamic in the context of South Africa between different groups that we have not discussed at all. No, I mean, the fundamental, I think, if I may add, although this is something which Kim should really add, is the fact that traditional migration studies has concentrated on people circulating and perhaps remittances, money circulating. There is not having so much emphasis on the kind of circulation of, by looking at religion, ideas, objects, spirits, practices, embodiments, and that is linked to a new theory of globalization. So it goes beyond, so it's linking, if you wish, theories of migration that were too much focused on the circulation of people as labor or as people becoming from one nation to another, and then so back and forth, or the remittances, but not enough on those other things, the objects, things, materials, ideas, practices, dispositions.
But the distinction between circulation and journey.
Between journey, of course, the question is, it is insofar as we do not analyze the journeys as much as the migrants' narratives of the journeys. So we don't take the objectifying gaze. The circulation actually is more the one in which we take the third person perspective, while in the journeys we take simply we listen to the first-person narratives. And these narratives are not only of those who have made the journey, but the way in which people already second, third generation include their own subjective narrative into collective narratives or into past narratives. And it's linked then to narratives of the nation and the changing narratives. So in this respect, the journeys has more to do with the way in which migrants, minorities, individuals, and groups experience and tell their own stories about both the journeys and their, again, relationship to incorporation or not, and so on. While the circulation in this aspect is more a third-person perspective, looking the circulation between different sides. So, yes.
So it's the phenomenological dimension that journeys ask how individuals, how the kind of people themselves make sense of the process of circulation that they experience.
The imaginary, I would say.
But it's phenomenological through narrative, mediated through narratives.
Whereas circulation would be, for example, what could be what Samadia was trying to present, circulating models of Dakwa. That's not, and you can then make comparisons between different models of Dakwa. You focused on Dakwa within the community, but there are also models of Dakwa which aim at conversion, which are directed at other communities. So that I would see as circulation, more objective gaze.
Anybody else would like to add something? We'll have to struggle with those issues that, thank you very much for your critical comments, because those are part of the things we're still struggling with, so thank you. Then I have to only thank the panelists in this panel. Thank you, especially Susan Martin. Thank you all. And now let's continue the conversation informally. Reception at the Berkeley Center. Everybody is cordially invited. There are very few people who have remained, which are not part of the project, but please do join us in having some refreshment, something to eat and to drink. Thank you.